All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Case Study Development, Protagonist, DecisionPoint, and Teaching Objectives. My name is Sandra Draheim and I'm the Marketing Manager for GlobaLens, who is bringing you this webinar today. GlobaLens is the publishing division of the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. Before we begin, I'd like to check the audio with all attendees who have joined us today. So if you can hear me, please click on the icon on your screen that looks like a hand. By clicking on it now, you are telling me you can hear me clearly. So if you can hear me, click on the icon that looks like a hand. Good, I see some hands going up. Very good. Good, I see a lot of hands raised, so I am encouraged by that. Thank you. If you have questions during this webinar presentation, you can please type them into the dialog box on your screen and then press send. We will answer as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation so that all attendees can hear the answers. But please, throughout the presentation, if you have questions, just type them into the dialog box and hit send. Additionally, I'm recording today's session and will send instructions regarding how to access it within 24 hours or less after the conclusion of the webinar. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Marc Robinson, Director of GlobaLens, as well as the Educational Outreach Division of the William Davidson Institute, again here at the University of Michigan. Marc?
Hi, Sandy. Thank you very much for the introduction and for organizing this webinar. I want to make sure everybody can hear me, so if I can have you one more time click the icon that looks like a hand. And since I can't see the same display that Sandy sees, I'm going to have her tell me that everybody has done so.
Yes, many, many hands are up.
Okay, good deal. So thank you everybody for joining us in today's webinar. We want to focus specifically on case study development and the protagonist and teaching objectives. As Sandy said, I'm Marc Robinson. I'm the Director of Educational Outreach and GlobaLens here at the William Davidson Institute. Sandy, as she said, is the Marketing Manager for us. Very briefly, this is the things we want to cover. A lot of you are here as an update and to get some information about the NextBillion Case Competition and some specific items that we saw kind of universally across the board in the entries we've received so far, and we will get to that. Here's some of the other things we want to talk about. I won't bore you with those. At least I won't bore you with reading them. Some objectives by the end of today. I really want you to be able to identify and introduce a case protagonist in your case study, be able to describe some characteristics of the problems that are presented in the case studies, and then be able to create good teaching objectives that are aligned with what you want to accomplish with your case study, as well as make them attainable given the protagonist's situation and capabilities in the organization he's in. Very briefly, for those of you that are not familiar with GlobaLens, we've been in operation for about 5, coming up on 6 years at the University of Michigan's Business School. We are focused on case writing as well as publication of the materials we write, and increasingly on receiving and publishing submitted materials, mostly case studies from great faculty members and faculty-student teams around the world. We've had a tremendous amount of growth in the last several years, and a lot of our catalog focuses on some of the niche areas. If you go to globalens.com, you'll be able to see some of the areas that we really highlight, and shortly you'll be able to see an improved website responding to some of the feedback we've gotten to make things easier for you to find. So I think Sandy is going to jump back on here and give everybody an update on the NextBillion Case Competition.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I wanted
talking until Sandy comes back on.
Great. I'm back on the line just briefly to talk a little bit about the NextBillion Case Competition. I thought a lot of our attendees today would like to hear a quick update, since many of you tuning in with us today are actually people that entered the competition. First, a short recap of the entries. We're really excited about the competition and their entries this year because we've had approximately 63 total case entries to this year's competition, which has very much doubled what we've had in past years, so we're very pleased about that. We have entries from both individuals and also entries from teams of individuals, but if we talk about the total number of people that have entered, that total is 150 people, but that equals only 63 entries. So we have over 50 universities represented globally with the people that entered, and well over 10 countries. Mark alluded to this earlier, but one of the major reasons we're holding this webinar today is some commonality of some challenges that we noticed within entry forms, and those have to do with Protagonist, the DecisionPoint, and teaching objectives. So the rest of this presentation will focus on that. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that the submission due date for the contest is December 14th. So thanks for letting me share that update with you, and I'll put you back with Mark.
Thanks, Sandy. I really appreciate the update. As Sandy said, we really do want to focus a lot of the webinar here on some things that we saw, hopefully that will help you create some better case studies, not only for the NextBillion Case Competition, but just in general. Some information we've gathered in talking to several faculty teams and faculty student teams about writing case studies. I'm going to move through the slides here as quickly as I can, because what I really want to do is leave time for questions and answers. I believe just from the email traffic we've gotten that many of you will have some questions for us. If you do get some questions that come up in the middle of this, please do send them as a text message via the web seminar chat feature, and we'll be able to address those. So first, let me start with going over really quickly what is a business case. And we're talking about teaching case studies, not research-oriented case studies. And at its core, a business case study is a teaching tool. And here are some of the components on your screen of what makes a good case study. That it tells a story, it's designed to be solved through classroom discussion, but there really is no right answer. A couple of key issues, that it is focused on a central decision point, some kind of a dilemma or challenge that is being faced by a protagonist who is the central figure in the case study. We will talk about that more in just a little bit. The element of a time frame is a very critical component, and by time frame we mean that the decision being faced, the challenge being faced by the organization and the protagonist is going to take place at a time. There's something that has to be done, and the information that is available to the protagonist and to the company is going to be limited to what was really available at the particular instant when the case study was taking place. This becomes a little bit of a challenge, especially in creating good teaching objectives, which I'll talk about more in just a little bit here. And I also wanted to talk about the issue of bias. One thing that is really good about using business cases as a teaching tool is you can interject bias, even though you want the background of the case to be factually accurate. The story of the case, the fact that you have a protagonist who has feelings and wishes and desires, can introduce bias by his background, can introduce bias by the things he's trying to accomplish. You can introduce bias into a case by introducing other characters that have feelings or thoughts about the situation or what the actual needs are. So you can create a more rich and compelling story than you could in a typical narrative or a straightforward research paper. A couple of things that a case study is not is it is not just a summary of events that happen at a company. It's not a research paper. This, while well documented, and if there are sources that you use, we do want you to document those. It is not going to probably be as extensively documented as a research paper. And critically, it is not a marketing tool for the organization. Many of you are writing cases or have written cases that you're working with specific organizations, and the marketing organization and the marketing department will want to have some kind of an input to put them in a good light, and you need to be on guard against that. You do want to tell a true story and a compelling story and factually accurate, but you know, the best case studies honestly highlight challenges that organizations face, and not only the successes. So the protagonist is the central character of the case study. In very many case studies, this is a CEO. It can be other people in an organization. We have seen and produced case studies effectively that focus on teams. A good protagonist could be the leader of a team wherever it is embedded in an organization. But the best protagonists are people that the students that you're teaching can aspire to be. They're people that the students can see themselves becoming after they're finished with their studies and after they're on their career paths. The use of the protagonist creates a perceptual context for the case study. It gives it a focus and a meaning other than just describing the background of the company. We have found, and I think most of you that have taught cases would agree, that having a real protagonist in a real organization is far better than having a fictitious protagonist or a fictitious organization, because students can sense when the organization or the protagonist is fictitious, and they essentially will begin to focus most of their energy on determining what the organization you're describing really was, or who the person you're focusing on really was, instead of trying to solve the issues that you hope to present by writing or using the case study. The protagonist is going to have a set of roles and responsibilities that are appropriate for his or her level in the organization. This is an important thing to keep in mind, and again, we'll talk about this more in just a little bit. You don't want to give the protagonist a problem to solve that isn't really appropriate or realistic. Again, the students can see when something like that is not a realistic set of responsibilities, and they'll try to either expand or limit their answers in terms of what they see as viable for the protagonist. In just a second, we're going to talk about how the protagonist and the teaching objectives are intermixed and how they influence each other. The decision point is another critical component of the case study, and again, it is developed by and gives context to the case study. There are consequences of any given decision, and the best case studies set up a realistic set of consequences for making poor choices that are immediately discussable by the faculty member in a group discussion in the classroom. We try very hard to highlight those consequences in the teaching notes so that the instructor has context available for what would happen if things went the way they probably should have, or if there's inappropriate decisions made, what would be the consequences of those. Also, frequently, the decision point that's presented at the beginning of a case study is presented in rather more simplistic terms, where there's a pretty clear choice where somebody has to make a presentation or make a decision, make a recommendation. And once you get to the end of the case study, the students find that the challenge really being faced by the protagonist is much more complex, that there's more on the line in terms of personal or organizational consequences that they need to factor in to their answers. So what seems to be a simple choice really is not a simple choice. And finally, building in a degree of urgency early on in the case really helps the students project themselves into the case study. You have a very limited amount of time in a case study, usually less than 2 pages, to grab the student's attention and make them care about the case and make them want to make the decisions and want to dig in and do research so they can make good recommendations. This is really the storytelling part of the case study where creative writing is really needed. Sometimes it's necessary to make the urgency a little artificial, give some kind of a deadline that, if missed, has some kind of immediate negative consequence, and make that shorter rather than longer, even if it's a little contrived and a little fictitious. This is one place the students will not dig for the most part. So the teaching objectives, those of you who have heard me talk, I believe are probably the most critical component of a well-written case study. We try to put all of our objectives in this form. After discussing the case, the students will be able to, and then use a good action verb to describe what you want the students to know or what you want the students to be able to do. There's a good listing, there are several good listings of action verbs in Bloom's taxonomy. If you look up our note on how to write a case study on GlobaLens, you will see a couple of charts in the back which will give you a good set of action verbs that make good objectives. The one objective or the one word you really want to shy away from is understand. So you don't want students to be able to understand something or some aspect of something, because there's really, in the end, no way to assess whether they understood it. You also want to avoid writing your objectives in a way that really leaves them with a yes or no choice, or a choice between 3 things, which makes it very easy to accomplish. So a couple of examples from case studies that we've written or case studies that we've published that have been submitted are listed here. And you can see there are some of these objectives which are more affective, where you want students to be able to empathize with the frustration. That's a little more difficult to assess, but it's still a viable objective if you want them to assess something or to build something, or as you see in the last one, to make a pitch for something, which would entail them actually creating some kind of a presentation and being asked to persuade a skeptical audience. Those are really good objectives, and they build multiple sets of skills on different levels, and they lead to really good case study decisions and case study analysis. So a couple of criteria of the teaching objectives are listed here. They need to be clear, so usually one idea per objective. So you don't want students to be able to list, define, describe, assess, and compare a set of terms. You want them to do one of those things. Generally, if I've got a list like that, I take the most difficult, most complex word, so to be able to assess or be able to compare different terms, as the main objective, and then as a sub-objective, either written someplace else in your syllabus or just in notes to yourself as an instructor, or in the teaching note, identifying that the students have to be able to come up with a list and be able to define those things as well. This is really critical, that the objective needs to be measurable. And the reason for that is because in the end, these are teaching tools. If you have good objectives, it will give an instructor that did not write the case study an idea of how to lead the discussion, to get the students back around to what's really important in the case study, which may not be immediately apparent to the students and perhaps to a faculty member who just reads the case study, which is why we insist on teaching notes. it also gives you a way to assess how the students did and whether they learned what you want them to learn. I believe really strongly that it's worth giving the students the objectives so that they know how to measure themselves. If you expect them to create a presentation and what they expect is to be able to define a term, you've got a potential challenge on your hands. So having the students understand what you want them to know, what you want them to be able to do, and then finally how they prove it to you are the critical elements. This last bullet on there for authentic assessment, case studies are one component of authentic assessment, but for those of you not familiar with the term, an authentic assessment is having them create something that they would have to do as part of their normal duties if they were an actor in the case study. So create a report, interpret a financial plan, make a recommendation, compare two business models or compare two regions where you might be introducing a business. Those are all examples of things that people in that given function would have to do, and they are really, really good assessment techniques because the students feel good about them and there's something concrete for you to look at. I just want to throw this term out here, criterion referenced objectives. This is the most complex type of teaching objective. It's very detailed. Writing these out as a component of your case study is very frequently overkill, but if you go through the exercise to see what assumptions you're making in terms of especially the conditions that you want the students to perform the task under and the criteria by which you're going to evaluate them, you can come up with a very good teaching objective, and it's focused on the performance. I won't discuss this in depth. I'd be happy to take questions about this. I would be happy to do another web seminar just focus on this. If anybody would like to do that, please just send Sandy and me a note so we can gauge what the interest is on that. Okay, so this is what I really want to focus on for the balance of the next few minutes and then open it up for questions. And this is something that we saw that was, I don't want to say it was missing from the case studies we received in the NextBillion competition entries, but it wasn't apparent that this was something that was well understood or well grasped. And when we went back over the documentation that we had provided and the support we had given people, we found that we had made the assumption that people understood this when in fact I'm not sure that anybody or everybody really did. So when you write your case study, I feel pretty strongly that the objectives should be the first step in creating it because these are educational materials. But frequently when the case study is being written, the author has a protagonist and a company and a story in mind. So it's difficult to say whether the protagonist came first or whether the objectives came first, and it really isn't worth a detailed argument about the chicken or the egg because they both tend to evolve together, but there's very definitely an interplay, influence, I guess, on each other. So if you have a protagonist who's a CEO, they're going to have a set of things that they should be able to do, that they can be able to do, the impacts of which will be felt more across the organization if the decision is good or bad. And if you have a protagonist that is at a lower level, perhaps somebody that uncovers something wrong in an organization. We've seen some human resources cases where there was a potential for them to report some kind of an anomaly, and the impact of reporting or not reporting that are more felt at the personal level and at the human resources organizational level, and maybe not throughout the entire organization unless they uncover something that is clearly wrong. So you need to scale your protagonist, and sometimes you need to slightly alter the level of your protagonist given the objectives you want to meet. Down the left side of the slide, you see some factors that influence the protagonist. And I won't read those out to you, but you see the bottom one is the level of the protagonist. On the right side of the screen, you see some factors that influence the objectives. And again, I don't want to read those off to you, but you see the bottom one is, again, the level of the objective. I went back through some of the decision-making models and some of the educational models, and I found a really close alignment between these two ideas of the protagonist and the objective level. In general, and I know this is a vast oversimplification, but the protagonists tend to fall into one of three categories. They're either a problem identifier, which is at the lower level, a problem solver, which is in the middle of an organization, or a solution implementer, which is the leader of an organization, or one of the leaders of an organization. On the right side, if you broadly break up educational objectives into 6 main categories, which are listed there, from remember being the simplest down to evaluate and create being the most complex, you can see there's a pretty close alignment. And I know that there's, again, some simplification here, and people that are implementers of solutions also need to be able to remember and describe. But in general, these are the kind of tasks that you would expect people to make, to be able to accomplish at each level in an organization. So as you're thinking about your case study and you're thinking about what kind of objectives you want the students to be able to meet, take a look and make sure that those things are appropriate to the level of the protagonist you've selected. If you find that they're really not aligning, you may have to either alter your objectives to be appropriate to the protagonist, or you may need to alter the level of the protagonist and fictionalize that element of the case study so that you get the appropriate discussion that you need in the classroom. So I wanted to describe a couple of examples that we've seen fairly recently. One is a case that's available in our collection. If you search for it, it's Oxfam. And in this case, we ended up altering the protagonist slightly to be focused on a team instead of on a specific individual. And that was an effort to do a couple of things. One was to increase the expertise and scope of the position and the decisions needing to be made. And the other was because the person that was in the middle of the case was slightly uncomfortable with acknowledging how big of a role he played individually. A couple of other examples, these are cases that we have coming shortly. We ended up elevating a protagonist from a quality assurance manager level to the CEO's office, and it's not clear whether it will be the CEO or one of the other C-level executives in the company, because the scope and span of control that the instructor wanted the students to face was more appropriate to that level. So I can't give a lot of the specifics about that particular case right now, but the problem was that there were some anomalies that were going on that the QA manager was being alerted to. She had to make a decision about what to do with them, which was a great story. It was appropriate to her level. It was the focus of the case, but the problem was that the impact of doing or not doing what she was being tasked with acting on would have created a small level impact within the company that would not have affected the company's operations tremendously. But if that same problem is elevated and now the recommendation has been made, the anomaly has been uncovered, and it's been reported already to the C-level organization, then making the decision or not making the decision has a great impact on everything from marketing to consumer confidence to ability to market to potentially their supply chains. Another example we have is a case that is being developed now where the gist of the case was focused on marketing for a particular organization, but once we really got into the writing and into dealing with both the actual protagonist and the instructor that was writing the case study, the issues were more human resources issues. And so we altered it to be a person that was in charge of the human resources department for a very large organization that did a lot of marketing. So the background of the case is marketing. It's still appropriate to teach in a marketing course, but the focus is really on these specific issues and how making poor decisions in that arena would affect the entire organization. So some of the impacts that these things can have, that this iteration between the objectives and the protagonist can have, is that it frequently causes the decision to be more complex than it first appeared, which is a good thing. That's by the end of the case, you want the students to understand there's more depth than what they initially saw. This also serves to really align the objectives very closely to the reality of the protagonist's level and station within the company. There are some cultural things to watch for that leaders of organizations in different countries and different cultures sometimes have different responsibilities and expectations. So you want to be sensitive to those, but I'll assume that if you're writing a case study about one of those areas, you understand how culture can impact those things. Another thing that this tends to do, we found, is it tends to increase the urgency the students feel because they see that the objectives are appropriate and that the decisions are appropriate. The final thing that this may do is it may cause you to make your case study a little more complex by adding other offices, other secondary protagonists and agencies and characters into the case study that will increase the richness and the depth of the case study. There's the idea of red herrings, which these additional elements can add, which is just simply things that are distracting that appear to the students as things that may be more important than they really are to solving the case study, to creating a good recommendation for the case study. And those are things that, if added, are really good to add in the teaching notes so that the instructor knows why they were added and how they were added, and really what the intent is. Okay, so I tried to move through this as quick as I could. I hope that that we've been gathered up some questions here. I see Sandy. No, she has not sent me any questions. I saw she had. Sorry, I will go back to that. Or I won't. Sandy, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, Mark. I was hoping I could share with you some of the questions we've gotten in. I can just read them to you out loud.
Please do. I'm going to mute this because I'm getting a little feedback, so there might be a little delay between Sandy reading the question and the answer, so please bear with us.
Okay. One of the first questions we've had come through is relative to not only the NextBillion competition, but also to what's called an A case and a B case. The A case having a decision point at one point in time and a B case with a decision point at another point in time. So this attendee is wondering, is that A-B format acceptable for the NextBillion competition, or would a conventional case with just one decision point be preferred?
That's a really great question. And in general, I would say that, well, let me answer the easy part of the question first. It is definitely acceptable to have an A case and a B case as part of your submission to NextBillion. So that's the easy question to answer. The more difficult question to answer is how you structure those things. We frequently see when we're working with faculty members that they really have a much broader set of challenges over a more extended timeline, which makes it appropriate to having an A and a B case. We encourage them to write both of the case studies together, to combine the ideas into a single teaching note when they can. This does increase the scope and the complexity of the writing and of the teaching note. I don't want to scare you away from that, but just be aware that when you add the second decision in, it will add the complexity of what you're trying to write. But I think it's a really good idea. We enjoy seeing those. The students like having those because then they can frequently see what happened as what really happened in a company as a result of the situation they were in, and then they can reset their thinking and reset their ideas to solving a second challenge.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to go to another question, again related to NextBillion. I have a question that relates to the case synopsis. For those of you that are attending today that don't know, part of our entry form requested a brief case synopsis. So someone's a little concerned that their case synopsis might be a little bit different than the final case. So they're wondering if that will be a problem.
Okay, thanks, Cindy. Again, that's another really good question, and that's a big part of why we wanted to have this web seminar. We actually anticipated that would happen. We saw, looking over the last couple of times we'd run the case writing competition, that unless we got people thinking earlier about the case study and how the story would flow out and what the teaching objectives would be, we had a big drop-off between the number of people who expressed interest in entering and the number of people who actually entered. So we really added this component so that you could think through how you would structure your case study, who the protagonist would be, what the objectives would be. For those of you that don't know, as part of the case writing competition, we decided to give some feedback based on the case synopsis, which is very closely aligned to our publication process when we receive submitted materials from outside authors, where we give them general feedback, and then if there's some specific things that we uncover that can be improved, we provide that more specific feedback at that time. We wanted to do that as part of the case writing competition. We also added this webinar in that same vein to give some feedback. So I guess the short answer is we expected that some of the synopses may change from the final case study. If there are changes you're thinking about and you've received your feedback already from us and you'd like us to take a look at a revised synopsis, we'd be happy to do that. So anyway, whoever asked the question, thank you very much. That was a really good thing for us to be able to highlight.
Thanks, Mark. Another question from a faculty member that's attending today. Classes are getting larger, semesters are getting shorter, so given these forces, what do you consider to be the ideal case length?
Oh, if I had the answer to that. It's a really difficult question to answer because on one hand I agree the class sizes are getting bigger, semesters are getting more compressed in terms of how much information you're expected to deliver. There's at least the perception that students don't want to read as much or that they resist reading long cases. So, in general, we encourage cases that are on the order of 12 pages long. The shorter end of that scale is, in the 8-page range is probably on the short end. We do receive some cases, and we even write some cases that are closer to 5 pages. But what we find is that it's difficult to develop the depth and complexity of a case study in fewer than about 8 pages. On the other end, we have a few case studies in our collection that are as long as 55 or 60 pages, which are on the outside edge of being acceptable. They're very rich, very detailed, very complex cases, and those tend to be about organizations or issues or cultures that the students may not know much about, so there's more depth about background material. So the more familiar the students will be with the situation, with the company, with the level of a protagonist, the shorter the case can be because you don't need to introduce those things. As for the most appropriate length, again, I'll probably say someplace in the 8 to 12 page range is probably ideal. For those that feel that students don't want to read as much or are resistant to that, we do encourage the use of appropriate media on a content replacement basis. So if there's a video that's already available on the internet or something that people can access fairly easily, or that you can produce fairly easily and post as a component of deciphering the background material of a case study, I do encourage you to do that because the students do seem to be more engaged with that, and in some cases tend to expect that. That will make your case study shorter because you'll expect the students to watch the video or to do something else as a component of the case study that you don't necessarily have to write. I hope that was clear enough. Sandy, let me know if that answered the question. If you get a follow-up question from that person, let me know.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, I will. Our next question is this, also from a faculty member. Do you have any advice for providing online materials for a case, for example, a video of the protagonist, setting up the decision point, for example?
Sure. That's similar to something I was just talking about. It is possible to do that either as the introduction to the case or maybe as the conclusion or potentially as a background piece in the case study where you're talking about a specific set of circumstances or a specific challenge or piece of background information about a company or about the protagonist. We've found that students are more accepting, I think the public is generally more accepting of video that's produced on a handheld device or some kind of a consumer available device down to cell phone video. With the rise of YouTube, people just seem to think that those videos are more appropriate than they were 5 or 10 years ago when doing a video meant usually hiring a professional videographer and getting studio time. So if you can create those things, a fairly inexpensive video or even a lot of cell phones now will produce perfectly acceptable videos. I would caution, though, that if you use videos to keep them down to no more than 3 minutes, preferably closer to 2, because if you observe the behaviors of students when they're watching video clips on TV, especially if they're or on their computers, especially if they're quote talking head videos where it's just somebody looking at a camera and delivering information, they have a pretty predictable pattern of behavior. Well, first they'll watch it for 10 or 15 seconds and then they'll minimize it or open something else over it on their computer for another 30 seconds or so, and then they'll turn down the volume and then they'll stop listening to it altogether. So instead of creating one long 10-minute video that explains something, if you can break it down into really targeted shorter videos and give the students the chance to open them up at separate points, I think that's a far better strategy. I also want to throw out that another effective strategy is using still pictures and doing voiceover, and there's several software packages available where you can display the pictures and talk over them. Those are also effective, in some cases more effective than the video of somebody just talking to a camera.
Thank you, Mark. I have another question relative to the NextBillion competition. And this would involve faculty guiding a student team. How strongly are faculty to influence the case submission by a team of students? For example, the writing, the research, and then should this be reflected in the submission?
That's another great question. And as an educator, I would say the role of the faculty member on the team needs to be appropriate to the level of the team. At the end of this process, if your case is either selected as the winner or if it's not selected as one of the winners, but we ask you to publish it, your name will be associated with the case. And Sandy will aggressively market the case studies. We've had good luck with getting the NextBillion case studies adopted into very many of the top 100 business schools. You'll bump into people at conferences such as the Academy of Management or the Academy of International Business, and people will ask you about them. So you want this to really reflect your best effort. But I also think that this is a great learning opportunity for the students and for them to get really good mentorship from you about how to create the case study that's the best possible that they can create. So I feel a little bit like I'm dodging your question, but I'll give you an analogy. I'm a scout leader for our local Boy Scout troop, and in that capacity I'm the Eagle Scout mentor, and our criteria for evaluating the Eagle Scout projects are such that they need to be appropriate to what the Scouts' capabilities are. So we see Eagle Scout projects that are really, really ambitious, affecting sometimes entire regions or states, and sometimes we see Eagle Scout projects which are much less ambitious, but are very well designed and executed because that's more appropriate to what the Scouts' abilities are. So in deciding how to approach this, I would really take a good look at what the student's ability level is. Ask them directly, what do they want to get out of this? You may find, or you may know that your students want to go into teaching, into academia, and you may guide them one way. You may find that what they really want to do is document a specific decision or a specific problem that's really important to them, but they fully intend to go on to be practitioners. So you may give them different advice depending on what their goals are at the end of this.
Thank you, Mark. Another question. The organization in my case study has multiple decisions or dilemmas. So do you have any advice on selecting a focus decision point, or maybe some criteria to select a decision point?
It's a difficult question in the abstract, but it's not an uncommon question that our case writers here at the William Davidson Institute face. Frequently, the different decisions or dilemmas are of a nested variety where the answer to one leads to more dilemmas in the second issue, which the answer to that will lead to more dilemmas or challenges in a third issue. If they're really unrelated decisions, especially if the challenges being faced are being faced by different protagonists, I would say that you may have different case studies instead of one case study. We have begun to try to address those kind of challenges in some of our case studies by writing a narrative which is kind of a central description, a central repository of the background for all of those challenges and all of those dilemmas, and then writing a fairly short case study, which might be as short as 4 pages or 5 pages, which describes that particular protagonist's challenges, but draws on this pool of common information and common background across several different case studies. So I hope that answered the question without knowing specifically what the different challenges and dilemmas are. It's a tough question to answer. If you would like some assistance and you have a specific example or a specific challenge that we can help address, please feel free to email us, and we'll see if we can give you some help on that.
Thanks, Mark. Our next question is from a NextBillion entrant. My case is at the intersection of many fields and can be used in several different types of courses, such as international business, policy, strategic management, sustainability, and so on. But we don't want to be too extensive. Are you expecting the case to focus on a few core courses, or is there no limit because they're thinking this will influence the teaching objectives?
If you write the objectives such that they're appropriate for multiple classes, I think that that's fine. Most of our case studies are appropriate for different kind of classes, but what we see is that usually the author of a case is approaching the material from one particular business discipline more than others, and that's a function of their background and their training and their expertise, maybe their current research interests. And the objectives tend to become more focused on that specific set of objectives and that specific set of models and theories that ground the discipline in business. If you have specific questions that we can help answer, we'd be happy to do that. It's a difficult question to answer in the abstract, but I would be happy to help you if you have those specific objectives that you think are meeting very many courses and you want some help in either cutting those down to an appropriate number or just validation that they're appropriate over multiple courses.
Thank you, Mark. And again, apologies to our attendees for the audio issue. We are coming up on the 1-hour mark, which is when we said this particular webinar would conclude. So I'd like to ask anyone whose questions we did not answer to either email them to one of us directly, to either Mark or to me. We'll both be responding to you. And again, I had a couple of questions come in about, will this presentation be recorded? Will it be available? Will the presentation be available? Yes to all of those questions, and so everyone that attended today will be getting an email from me indicating how to access both the presentation itself, the slide deck, as well as the recording of today's presentation. And again, I apologize for any questions we could not get to. I want to thank all of the NextBillion contest entrants. You've been fantastic. I know that the cases that are going to come in from you will be fantastic as well, and we really appreciate that because we're very focused with this particular contest on increasing the availability of teaching materials that give us some business strategies to alleviate poverty. So I will sign off at this point and turn it back over to Mark to conclude our presentation today.
Thank you, Sandy. I just want to echo what Sandy said. If you do have any additional questions or things that you would like some clarification on, please do feel free to email us. I'd ask you to put both of us in the email subject or in the